I guess most of them happen when you're very small. Something like learning to count or learning the alphabet. Most of us don't remember learning to count. I certainly don't. Or learning to read. But once you've got it, it just opens up a whole raft of new stuff, which wasn't there prior to that. And I can certainly imagine developments in civilizations and developments in human culture over time, in which those kinds of things have emerged on the scene, gateway concepts operating at a cultural level that open up possibilities for thought that simply weren't there before.
Okay, so I wanted to pick up right there in Fred's very interesting, recently posted video called Consciousness and Gateway Concepts. This is such a wonderful media ecological orientation that Fred is opening up. I think one way to maybe track out some of the things that he's suggesting is to go look at the book called Oh, What a Blow That Phantom Gave Me by Edmund Carpenter. Now, Carpenter was an anthropologist who, he was a colleague of McLuhan's, but in the late 60s he was commissioned by the government of New Guinea to go into Paw Paw and to help try to, I guess, diffuse some of the rivaling tribal acts of violence and cannibalism and all kinds of other things. What Carpenter did there was bring in various forms of communication technology that had an amazing impact sort of instantly on these tribes and these cultures, and it really transformed their modes of thought, their ways of understanding themselves and others, and the ways of organizing themselves socially. One of his most interesting examples was the use of the mirror. And again, these are tribes in Paw Paw who, these indigenous peoples, had never seen any modern technologies, and he brought in their tape recorders and cameras and video recorders and mirrors, chessboards, books. The experience with the mirror was one of the more fascinating. That there were, I can't remember the particular area, maybe it was Seal, but there was a certain area where the people, when they first encountered the mirror, there was an astonishing sort of, their native reaction was to cover their mouth and duck. They'd sort of go like this, and again, the sort of identification of the soul with the breath and the trying to cover it. It's as if the sudden realization of one's objective nature in the world almost sucked their soul right out of them, and it gave a kind of fear. And the reaction was almost universal in the region, and it, for Carpenter, was very significant that there was a sudden, I guess to use Fred's word, sort of a gateway concept had broken through, this sudden dawning and realization of one's self as one's face or one's body as a kind of object there for others, rendered, very explicitly, and it infected the person with a kind of instant self-consciousness or self-awareness. I think one of the more interesting aspects of that is what Carpenter found is that just a little while after that, he had gone back to those same place, those communities, and he almost didn't recognize the place. It had been transformed by a new dawn of self-awareness. And I think it was really interesting how much, the people had placed mirrors up in public areas. They were now grooming themselves in front of it and had taken on, I guess, a kind of sense of self-awareness and reflection upon self that was made possible by mirrors. Now, we take mirrors for granted and we assume mirrors, but they're actually, they're quite, high sophisticated technology, and historically, they did introduce a kind of reflection. Now, the thing that I find that's most interesting about this and how it relates, I think, to Fred's video, what I want to pick this up on, or how I want to pick this up, is I think that some people were very critical of Carpenter, and they said, oh, how could he do this? How could he go and take these indigenous people and sort of infect them with modern technologies, and they transformed themselves, and it really, he was meddling as an anthropologist. How do you do it? And Carpenter acknowledges it, and then he says, why do so many people right now tamper with themselves without realizing they're doing it? That, to me, is a very, very witty and responsible retort. And I think he could really be defended on that claim that right now we are in a huge laboratory and very few people realize the degree to which we are experimenting on ourselves and we are bringing about radical changes in consciousness. The simplest example would be Google search or search engines, Dogpile, any of these sort of meta crawlers, these things that allow for compiling and archiving and accessing information in ways that up until the last 10 years ago would have been utterly impossible. To really try to understand what search engine mind is and how search engine mind is radically transforming what we mean by knowledge, what it means to be knowledgeable. I'm not sure that some people will be knowledgeable in the future. I mean, always, I guess we could say, knowledgeability has been a possession of the few, and there's always been elitism. There's just different criteria now. It seems as if you ask an older person, how many poems do you know by heart? How much of a book could you recite? Or there seems to be, in older people, a real concern to internalize knowledge, to make it their own. The more that a person, I think, is grown up with search engines and the idea that the information is just there and what you need is access to it, it seems like a radical shift is happening, and it's happened overnight. I mean, in the same way that when Carpenter saw in these tribes in New Guinea a radical transformation, but then within a couple of days they had grown accustomed to it and just adapted their lives to this newfound realization of sort of self-objective sort of, I guess, relations of oneself as an object. And it had been so easily appropriated, it transformed their culture, and there was no recovering from it. It was in the way that Fred's talking about, of like the way that we learn to read or the way that we learn to count. It just becomes part of who we are, and it's what we see the world with now. It's no longer something that we just know. It's what we know the world with, and by that stance, it's sort of transparent. I think that this is happening, it's like just day by day as we are experimenting on ourselves here in modern Western culture. I mean, not only is mass widespread education, it's about 100 years old, I mean less than that, especially if you're going to do like public education as a movement, we'll give it 80 years or something like this. The more that we try to see what the meaning will be of genetic engineering. I was at the Natural History Museum in Chicago, and amazing the tree of life and the sequencing of DNA that is now going on. I mean, the genome projects for all of the different species and organisms, and how all of this is being compiled into a universal understanding of what we mean by life. I mean, if it doesn't have DNA, I think someone's going to say, well, that's not life then. Everything here is somehow related through its DNA. That is the living. The living somehow share a code or a sequence, and that is now part of our self-awareness. There's no way to give that the shake. It would be hard for, I think, a creationist to go to the Natural History Museum in Chicago. Or, I think a person would have to, I guess, have to just bite the bullet. If their faith is so shaky, it probably would need to change. I think it's another good example, though, of the meaning of religion is radically changing in our lifetimes, right? So I think it would be fun for maybe a way to wrap up this video is to say, please, other people, help myself, help Fred, follow up this video, try to explain, elaborate, detail, lay out all of the gateway concepts that are now being introduced in the culture. It's everything from what could be called search engine orientation. I think that's one. I think DNA and evolution orientation. I think that is a major one. I think, I don't know. What else? Okay, thanks.